thank you for everybody being here. It's been going super well and we're learning lots, and I'm really grateful for all of you coming and for your chapter. So thanks, and thanks, Patrice, for doing this. I'm going to hide now.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, so please allow me to introduce our presenters for today. We have Joanna Malo. Say it correctly.
Yeah, Malo. It's all good.
Malo. All right. Joanna Malo, Erin Willson, and Katie Hanna. And they will be speaking with us today about sexual abuse and human rights in sport and why it matters. So I pulled a couple lines from the abstract, and I hope that's okay with you all if I just share that with everyone. With high prevalence rates of sexual abuse in sport, organizations must align the performance ladder with a firm commitment to preventing human rights abuses. Over the last decade, many survivors across the globe have come forward detailing the systemic sexual abuse perpetrated in sport, and in response, changes are beginning to take root. So in order to create an athlete-centered human rights safeguarding strategy that considers the unique cultural contexts and perspectives within an athlete's life, global approaches to safeguarding must center the experience of athletes, guarantee systems of trauma-informed remedy, and incorporate primary prevention. So I'm going to turn it over to our presenters, and I want to also thank you so much for you all and your important work. This is incredible. I got a chance to read your work, so this is awesome. So thank you. I'll turn it over to you all.
Great. Thanks so much, Patrice. Thanks, Yvonne, and great to see all of you today, and thanks for joining us. My name is Katie Hanna, and I'm really pleased to be joined by Joanna and Erin. Writing this chapter together was a really wonderful process of just taking together all the amazing work that's been happening leading up to addressing sexual abuse and human rights in sports. So today we're going to just briefly talk on some of the highlights that we have from the chapter. So certainly covering a bit on the history of safeguarding, covering the sport's autonomy and the violation of human rights, some on the prevalence of harms and seeing the global picture and the landscape of what is taking shape. Talking about some of the principles around safe sport entities and what's effective in making sure that those services are trauma-informed. And then as we think about moving forward, using that human rights approach, ways that organizations can address their culture, the accountability, as well as calls that we have to action. So just briefly, as we're thinking about the landscape and sort of setting the stage for addressing sexual abuse within sports, I think it's really important to just cover briefly the history that we've seen. And so we know certainly from leading experts who have highlighted the risk of child sexual abuse to elite athletes for decades, and only more recently have programs to prevent and respond to sexual abuse in sport receive the resources that are needed to begin to make systemic change. Incredible work has taken place over the last 20 plus years on the development of safeguarding programs in sport. So this includes things like the UK's development of child protection programs in sport in the early 2000s, the International Olympic Committee's consensus statements on sexual harassment and abuse in sport in 2007 and 2016, the development of the first international safeguards for children in sport back in 2012, safeguarding policies that were developed during the Commonwealth Games, and the inclusion of safeguarding and child rights that are in bids to host major sporting events, as well as in 2020, the establishment of Safe Sport Day. So we know that the safeguarding and sport landscape continues to expand through the work of Safe Sport International, the 2019 launch of the FIFA Guardians program, the 2021 launch of the International Olympic Committee's Safeguarding Officer in Sport program, and a 2021 report that was published regarding FIFA's consultation process to consider the creation of an international safe sport organization. And just last week, the IOC announced additional resources for safe sport. So we've seen across the globe that various countries have different models to address safeguarding. So in some countries, prevention education and recommended standards are in place. In other countries, national commissions have conducted independent inquiries. These are bringing together and hearing directly from affected individuals and then issuing reports for action. And in other countries, independent centers for safe sport have been created, which mandate governing bodies to follow specific policies and also address remedy after harm has been perpetrated. So a number of safe sport programs do exist across the world. These include, but certainly are not limited, just a picture of a few programs that exist certainly in the UK, in Canada, in Singapore, the US, and Australia. And we've seen certainly in Western countries that the government has played an important role in setting legal requirements for sport organizations and through independent safe sport organizations that operate outside of sport governing bodies. So for example, certainly in the US, we've seen in response to many sexual abuse reports that came forward, the US Center for Safe Sport opened in 2017, was then authorized by Congress. And in 5 years alone, the center received more than 10,000 reports, delivered nearly 3 million trainings, and set required prevention policies, as well as audited more than 50 sport national governing bodies and the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee. We've also seen similar initiatives in Canada with the opening of the Office of Sport Integrity Commissioner in 2022, which is a division of the Sport Dispute Resolution Centre of Canada. Its mandate is to administer Canada's Universal Code of Conduct that encompasses all forms of abuse, harassment, and discrimination, and oversees intake of complaints, conducts investigations, imposes sanctions, and monitors compliance of sport organizations. And there's so much more work that's happening around the world. So as more countries and sport organizations implement safeguarding programs, it's important to center affected persons and to also look at the role that sport plays in addressing these issues. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Joanna for the next section.
Thank you, Katie. So my part's going to be very short. I just want to talk a little bit about sports autonomy and how somehow this can lead to a higher associated risk to sexual abuse. So this phenomenon that we call sport exceptionalism are those actions and behavior that are very specific to sport. And I'm trying to exemplify here in terms of judo. I'm not a judo expert, I'm just married to one. So in judo, there are the specific rules of the context. So that's two people have some rules, and the goal is to throw the opponent to the ground. So that's not something that we see in society. These are very specific to combat sports and to judo. And in order to do that, there are proper ways to do it. There are proper techniques that you're allowed and not allowed to do. So that's what sport exceptionalism is about. When you think of swimming, and then I have a bit more experience in that because I was a swimmer myself. So there's a hole with water on it, and there are several lanes, and they're in specific distance, and then a specific stroke that you have to, whoever does it faster wins the race. But then there are rules within the rules, as in the 15-meter mark. If you've seen a swimming race, you have been seeing swimmers staying underwater. And then at a certain point, they have to emerge. That's the rule on the 15-meter mark. The head of the swimmer has to emerge the surface at that mark. If it passes, it doesn't mean that they're not swimming it anymore. They're just not following the specific rules of the sport. So that's what we call sport exceptionalism. And we see that in every single sports type. So because of that, because of this specificity, we've been given to sport this autonomy to regulate themselves. Like, this is kind of obvious when we think about the rules of the game and the context. And apart from that, we also have seen sport as something that is outside of society to some extent, as if sport holds this moral or higher value where everything is free and the values of sport and so on. Although this is out of the scope of this chapter, I think it is important to point out that it's not that we disagree with that. However, when we started to see cases of violence in sport, whether interpersonal violence, which is fully related to sexual abuse, or collective violence in cases of corruption, in cases of cheating, of course, people started to say, well, maybe we should not give sport this full autonomy for everything. And sport has been very hesitant to let people from the outside scrutinize what's going on within sports. With regards to this specific type of interpersonal violence that we talk about in this chapter, which is like cases of sexual abuse, what we have been seeing is an inability of sport as a whole to properly address these issues, as Katie said, in a trauma-informed manner. prevention efforts that are actually effective, and responses and remedy. So I'm going to read this quote here that is about an athlete. She was trying to help a teammate that was sexually assaulted. So she says, I was contacted by a female athlete who had been sexually assaulted by her coach at a national team event. So we're talking about elite level here. I went to the police, so outside sport, with the athlete with a file to file the complaint. I also reported the incident to sports. So this person reported inside sports and outside sports. A few other athletes came forward with similar sexual misconducts about the same person, which is very common. It's usually never a one victim case. The police never did anything, and the sport or organization also didn't do anything. The coach is still out there, is still coaching female athletes, and most likely abusing them. So what we see here is the sport's inefficiency to address the issue, and also there is a confusion because of this sport autonomy. Institutions from outside sports, it's not very clear to what extent can they have the competency to investigate what's going on within sports. Next slide, please. Can you pass, Katie? Yeah. So within this map here, what I was trying to say, all of those red dots are either public cases of sexual abuse and or places that have done research try to measure the extent of the problem. Regardless on how we try to interpret this map, like the divisions that we usually do on the globe, as in the past division, Orient and West, there are cases on both sides. And with the globalization, now we have the new division that is global North and global South. If we do that, we see cases. So the point is, this is happening everywhere. It's very hard to say that there is a sport free from harassment and abuse environment. So there's no continent free, there's no country free, and most likely no sports free. But I'm going to share just two quick examples. One of the most popular in a very sad way, it's the Larry Nassar case. This inefficiency of sports to deal with that allowed him to make 500 victims of sexual abuse throughout 28 years. And we're talking here about the United States, which is, from a performance perspective, the most powerful country when we talk about performance from a performance lens. And if you think from the institutional level, there's the recent case from Haiti, where there was a systemic sexual abuse, and then FIFA, which is a very powerful, I would say the most powerful international federation in the world, has not done a proper investigation. It was done from someone from the outside sports, from NGOs from outside sports, and now we're seeing that the ban of the perpetrated being lifted. So most of all, what I want to say is that it happens everywhere, pretty much in every sport. And now I'm going to hand over to Erin, and she's going to talk a little bit about those prevalence studies that I've mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah, so picking up on what Joanna was saying, we know that this is happening everywhere, and we do have a lot of, unfortunately, we have a lot of data to support those claims. And again, these are 5 studies that have happened, that have occurred in 6 or 7 different countries, but there's a lot more too. There's a few in Europe. There's a lot more coming up, which is really important. It's really important for us to have the data to demonstrate the scope and the depth of the problem. But what we're noticing is that regardless of country, as Joanna was saying, the rates are very similar. We are seeing high rates of psychological violence. We are seeing high rates of physical violence, sexual violence, and neglect. I will point out the numbers are slightly different. Only recently there's been a standardized tool to be used. And so every prevalence study is a little bit different because there wasn't a consistent measure across them. But I think some things that are important to recognize is typically when there's one form of abuse happening, there's multiple forms of abuse happening. And so this chapter specifically focused on sexual abuse, but there is typically the highest reported type of harm is psychological abuse. But again, typically when there's one, there's multiple. It is an indicator of, again, the systemic problems that are happening in sport and just the attention to cultural details that we need to be focusing on, because we really have to move away from this idea that it's just one perpetrator and one bad person. There's systemic problems that are happening that are causing multiple forms of abuse to happen and multiple types of harms and outcomes for athletes. I wanted to share a couple examples as well of what we were talking about. Again, the scope of abuse is quite broad. And in Canada, we conducted a study of national team athletes in 2019. We did find that psychological harm was the most frequently reported. And these behaviors included being shouted at in an angry or critical manner, having lies told about oneself, being put down, embarrassed, or humiliated, or being intentionally ignored after poor performance. And again, in this study and across multiple studies that we discussed in the previous slide, it's everything from contact to non-contact. And so we consider things like the sexual jokes and remarks and the sexual glances, sexually explicit communication. All of those things lead to a culture where things become appropriate. And so it starts small. It starts with just a comment here or there. Typically, it starts with that grooming process and those little things that you don't ignore, but then all of those things create this culture that's really unsafe. And so while we can talk about the most egregious behaviors and they are awful, it typically is indicating of a larger problem that's happening. And there's a lot of things that slide before that big thing happens. And so just being really attuned to some of those behaviors is really important. Sorry, one more thing I wanted to point out on the slide before. It's not a big deal. We don't have to go back. Also, there are multiple perpetrators, and I think that needs to be recognized too. I think we often hear about coaches. For sexual abuse, specifically, peers was the most frequently reported among Canadian national team athletes. And I think that's really important to recognize. Peer-to-peer violence is also just as traumatizing. It's often less regulated, especially now. There is a little bit more regulations between coaches and athletes, but between peers and peers, there needs to be a lot more attention to that as well, because it is a very massive problem as well. We've also seen across prevalence studies that there are specific groups of people that are more vulnerable to violence. And these are the same within sport and typically external to sport. Girls, women, not gender non-conforming, all reported higher rates of violence. People who identify as racialized or an ethnic minority also experience more rates of violence, particularly with physical violence, which again, when you think about the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that, it does kind of make sense as to why these particularly physical violence is higher within certain populations, and just something to really be paying attention to as we talk about who we are making these environments safe for. There's just groups that we need to be paying a little bit more attention to and understanding some of the structural issues that again cause some of these problems to continue to occur. Same with identifying in the LGBTQI+ community, bisexual and identifying as LGBT, we're all increased your risk of experiencing violence for the prevalence studies that assess this. We looked at sport level. Again, violence happens at every level of sport, but we did see a trend across prevalence studies that indicated that as you get to a higher level of sport, there is an increased risk of violence. Again, there's more training hours, it's more intense. There's a few factors, but again, recognizing it can happen anywhere, it can happen to any athlete, but there are some trends that indicate that more elite levels do experience these problems at higher rates. Disabilities, the findings have been really mixed on this, which is interesting. I can only really speak to the study that we conducted in Canada. We recognize that while we didn't find any differences through the data, there are also very specific risks within the para community that we didn't account for. And so things like working with your support system and the different accommodations, those can also increase your risk. And those were unfortunately things that we didn't measure. And so while the data isn't as strong on that, there is a lot of very specific risks that para athletes face that we also need to be considering when looking at rates of violence.
Thanks, Erin. And, as Erin, Joanna have shared, certainly when we think about the prevalence of abuse and the reporting channels that exist as those are emerging, it's really important to think about the perspective of an athlete coming forward to make a report. We know that outside of sport, there are so many barriers that survivors face when disclosing what's happened. And certainly this quote from a national team athlete in Canada is a really important one of the athlete sharing, quote, "I would never feel comfortable going to my national sport organization if I were harassed, and would 100% need an independent body to report to, I would be far too scared to say anything to my coach or organization. And so this really drives home the importance of having independent, say, sport entities and groups that function in civil society outside of sport that are part of that system of care and that collaborative network to help support survivors through multiple processes, which include through the sports system, as well as navigating whether it's civil, criminal, or educational processes as well. And so one of the resources that's really important to highlight that I want to just point you to take a look at, this came out late last year. As more safe sport programs are opening, this resource was published by the World Players Association, the Army of Survivors, and the Sport and Rights Alliance. So it outlines 6 key principles to embed in any safe sport program. So that includes first that it's human rights based, that it's survivor centered, that you have independency and accountability, you have safety and accessibility, you have meaningful stakeholder engagement, and that you have effective remedy. So our note that, in the chapter that we wrote together, certainly you could have an entire chapter on remedy. We didn't go deep into the details there. I do want to point to some other resources that are going to be coming out shortly this year. Certainly Kat Craig and Daniela Hertz and others have been engaging with affected persons, looking at responsible investigations. And as those resources come forward, I think they're going to be a great resource to the field. Additionally, within this resource around establishing effective safe sport entities, there are 5 essential functions that are outlined. The first is that you're providing support. Second, that there's reporting. Third, investigation. 4, that remedy. And then 5, prevention. So for those of you that are joining in as you're thinking about or you're involved with the creation of or development of other safe sport entities, really encourage you to take a look at this guide. I'm going to turn it back over to Erin for the next session.
Yeah, and so we did want to take some time to look towards the future and understand a little bit more about how we can work to remedy this problem, identifying some of the gaps that we have. And the first one on the next slide would be engaging survivors. And I think there's a few different approaches to be able to do this. Obviously, the survivor voice, they have a story, they have the experience, they have so much. I hate to say value in that, but there is so much power in what they can provide. And I think it's really important to be able to provide spaces to be able to listen to them. And that doesn't always necessarily mean asking them to tell their story, because that in itself can be very re-traumatizing for athletes. And I think this is something that when the safe sport movement kind of started, there was a lot of athletes who really wanted to share their stories because it hadn't been heard before. But there's a lot more value to athletes than just having their stories told. And I think it's really important to be able to engage athletes or survivors through the process, and not only to understand what happened to them, but let them help to try to solve the problem as well. So identifying gaps, provide suggestions for change, and be part of that change as well. There is a lot of work that can be done and ensuring that this is done in a very trauma-informed way. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has an excellent resource that I would highly recommend using. They identify 9 different aspects that you need to be considering when you do engage with survivors to make it trauma informed. So this includes making sure that you're providing supports for their well-being, making sure that they have control over their decisions, being prepared to both ask and listen to what they're wanting. I would highly recommend, if you are planning on engaging survivors in any of the work that you're doing, that you check out this resource. It's really, really well done. And again, some of those is both recognizing survivors' trauma, but also their trauma journey. And so every survivor is on a different place in their trauma journey. Some do not want to talk about it at all. Some are just looking for resources. Some are just looking to understand the reporting process. And so recognizing that when you're working with a victim, they may have may be in a very different moment, and that's really important to recognize. A lot of victims, you should be compensating them, especially if they're trying to tell their story, but being involved in this process can be very re-traumatizing, and they are providing a value and a service. And so making sure that that's accounted for when engaging with survivors. Giving them space to control and autonomy, I think, is really important. Again, recognizing that they have been coming from a place of that didn't have control is really important to be able to give that back to them when they are working with you through a place of change. And then just making sure, as much as possible, giving them proper support and resources that they need. Other ways to engage survivors, I think we also have to recognize, as we said before, there are different vulnerabilities, and I think we really need to be, if we're addressing safe sport, we have to address some of the underlying issues, and one of those is attention to equity, diversity, inclusion. There are a lot of groups of survivors that haven't really been engaged that should be the ones that are most vulnerable, and so just making sure that those groups are the equity deserving groups are really involved in this conversation as well. Other ways that we can involve survivors is making sure there's formalized athlete representation. So making sure if there's an athlete that's a voting member on a board of director, making sure there's a legitimized role to contribute to decision-making processes. And this really helps to avoid the tokenism that can happen a lot with, having an athlete there. You can check that box. It's really not about that. It's making sure it's a legitimized process. But recognizing that the burden shouldn't be just on athletes. It should be everyone's responsibility to be addressing this change and fixing the problem. And the problem shouldn't rely on survivors coming forward and sharing their voice and doing all of the work.
And as we think about the different ways that organizations engage with survivors and affected persons, it's also important to think about some of the roles of the culture that it plays. So what the responsibility and accountability is of sport organizations. And so much attention is often focused on the response after the fact. But we really also need to move the needle on preventing abuse from ever being perpetrated in the first place. And so in order to fully address all the harms that are caused to athletes in sport, accountability must address individual level sanctions and those organization-wide reforms. So this includes things like monitoring and supervision, providing policies to parents so that they're aware of what the organization is doing to prevent abuse in sport. Also requiring the inclusion of board members and getting required abuse prevention training and many other ways to go about a comprehensive prevention program. So we know that addressing sexual, emotional, and physical abuse in sport is also not only about creating a safe sport entity, it's also about prioritizing prevention. And we all play a role, all of us, in terms of continuous improvement that needs to be made to make the entire sport landscape safer for all athletes. So certainly at the elite level, but also for those grassroots level organizations and the entire group of sports, from the youngest of children that are participating very early on, all throughout the lifespan. And so when we think about prevention and what that looks like, it encompasses things like codes of conduct, abuse prevention training, the hiring and screening practices, monitoring and supervision plans, prevention and response policies, things like limiting one-on-one interactions between kids and adults, staff ratios, risk identification, so including a focus on environments like locker rooms, and having accountability mechanisms in place to address those policy violations. And so when we think about prevention, it also needs to move beyond a focus on compliance only. It needs to embed all the approaches at that social ecological model. So thinking about the public health approach to prevention, this includes the individual level approaches, community, institutional, and then the societal level approaches. And certainly when we think about the work that we can do, again, it's about all of us doing this together. We know that there are a lot of programs that are emerging for the first time, and there's an entire network all across the globe of groups that are coming together that can help support and lift up promising practices. And so a few additional things, just as we think about the importance of organizational culture, it's also important to acknowledge and note that the past cannot be erased or forgotten. It's important to take steps to acknowledge the harm, to commit to making changes in the environment, and dedicate time to rebuild trust or to rebuild trust with athletes, and hold ourselves accountable to make improvements. So while accountability is certainly necessary for individual perpetrators, the prevalence of sexual abuse in sport globally indicates the systemic and institutional practices that have allowed such behaviors to persist. For example, the power imbalance that we see between athletes and other sport stakeholders, so coaches, high performance directors, sport administrators, this has continually been identified as a contributor to sustained abuse in sport. There's an analysis that we reference in the chapter of child sexual abuse cases in organizations, and Aruga et al. Reported that adults in positions of power often go undetected because they are trusted, well-liked, and successful. sport organizations must ensure that safeguarding approaches are universally applied and address the underlying power differentials, particularly among successful and charismatic authority figures, and establish safeguards against traditional grooming practices. So one example of this is the rule of two in Canada and also in the United States. This rule is really about making sure that there's two adults or more present with athletes, including in training environments, during meetings, travel as well, because this increases the protections for all those parties. And certainly in the US, there's federal law that mandates requirements in terms of governing bodies following policies through the US Center for Safe Sport and their minor athlete abuse prevention policies. And in addition to those policies that are in place, it's also important to have athlete protection policies for kids, but also all players, for adults as well. And so in December last year, the National Women's Soccer League and the NWSL Players Association issued a joint investigative report. It recommended numerous changes. And one of note that was included is that within policies, clarifying that any sexual or romantic relationship between adult players and those in supervisory roles over players is strictly prohibited, even if the relationship is consensual. So having safe and accessible reporting options for athletes is also a really critical part of organizational culture. We know that there are so many barriers that survivors face around reporting, including within sport, the issue of retaliation. And so as we think about the responsibility that we have, it's about breaking down barriers to make it easier to report, safer to report, and creating those safe spaces, which will require some building and rebuilding and taking time through the trust process. But we also know that preventing abuse in sport cannot be done in a vacuum, from one team to the next or one league to another, enabling perpetrators to gain access to harm others, particularly when information isn't shared regarding individuals who pose risks to the community. We've seen investigative reports that this is a really important part of screening and hiring processes and information sharing, and that's something that we go into more detail within the chapter. And then lastly, we just want to touch briefly on auditing and monitoring and the important role that that plays. So we know that certainly programs need to embed those internal and independent audits in the work of governing bodies and local programs. Those independent checks and balances that are free from conflicts of interest. These are really critical to addressing historical trauma, to build trust with athletes, and establish safeguard practices and principles that can work. So one example, and again, just one, is that so on the screen you see in the US, there's an annual audit requirement. So this is embedded within federal law. So in 2020, when the Empowering Olympic, Paralympic, and Amateur Athletes Act went into effect, this requires the US Center for Safe Sport to publish those annual audits that they conduct of the sport national governing bodies in the US, as well as the NOC through the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee. This is one way to show transparency of here are the policies, here are the practices that are in place, but also the continuous improvement in the work that we can do together. I think it's a trust building process for athletes and parents and the public to see that we're talking about these issues. We are going to make reforms and changes. And so it's also important to really think about those internal audits that organizations can do as part of those effective governance approaches. We know that safeguarding is not about checking a box, and it requires a cultural change to overhaul the status quo of how sports have been governed in the past. And just as physicians and athletic trainers are brought on to support athletes' physical health, outside experts in safeguarding must also be welcomed in as valuable members of the team dedicated to the safety and well-being of athletes. And so for those of you working in sport that are joining, there's an amazing network of advocates, child advocacy centers, rape crisis centers, domestic violence programs, others within civil society organizations that are working together in collaboration with sport that can help, that have been doing this work for decades, that can be part of the solution with you. And so now as we think about some of the next steps within the safeguarding sport movement, I'm going to turn it over to Erin to share some of the calls to action.
Yeah, I think just bringing all of this together, what we wanted to emphasize that really this change is everyone's responsibility. It's not just on one group of people to solve it. I think everyone can play a role in moving this forward. I think it's really important to recognize the systemic nature of the problem. We really have to move away from there's bad apples in sport that we need to protect everyone from. There are so many systemic problems that need to be addressed. There's underlying issues like gender inequity, racialized inequity that are contributing to this problem. So we really need to start working at getting to the roots of the problem instead of just the surface level of naming and shaming and blaming the certain people that enacted bad things, because again, you can replace them and someone else will come in. We're not really, it's really a Band-Aid solution. We need to really enact a zero tolerance, not just policy, because I think policy is one thing, but behavior is another. And that includes no longer being able to defend or cover up or hide or protect those that are responsible for harm. I think that we really need to move away, understand that these behaviors are no longer acceptable, and our behavior moving forward needs to align with that. And one other thing that I want to say is we recognize that there isn't a perfect solution yet. There's a lot of people that are really trying their best to make it happen, and we still have a very long way to go from that. But I think as we have these conversations, making sure that they are respectful, recognizing that everyone is trying their best to solve the problem, and that we need to be working in a collaborative approach to make that happen, because we don't have it perfect yet. And unfortunately, every day is a day lost, and we need to all be working to move towards the future. So thank you for listening to this. We've really enjoyed this chapter, and we really hope that you do as well.
Thanks, Erin and Joanna. And Patrice, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to you for any questions. And again, certainly there's a lot that's covered in the chapter, and we encourage you to read it, take a look at it. But thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you all so much. It was very informative, and we just appreciate the work that you all are doing. So we'll now take some questions. I'm not sure if folks can actually unmute themselves, but I can definitely monitor the Q&A and the chat box if some folks wanted to add some questions there. So our first question comes from Tanya Herring. It says call to action. What are they present now? And like for the Olympics, they said, take the Olympics, for example. So what are some of the calls to action that are present right now? And anyone, I think, can jump in for that one. That question wasn't for anyone specific.
I think we can answer to that collectively. I think if you refer to systems that are in place on the Olympic Games, there's not much going on. Usually the IOC has one person that is in charge of receiving the reports, a small team. But one aspect that we need to think of, when Erin mentioned how collaboration is important, try to think you go through a sexual harassment or the sexual abuse or something. Disclosing this is something that it's very tough. So most likely you will do to someone that you already know or that is very close to you. So it's unlikely that if this happened in the sense of the Olympic Games, that the athlete or the entourage that was affected by this violence is going to identify that there is a safeguarding officer or someone responsible to receiving this report. Most likely this will be something that is shared internally. That's why we talk about this collective action, that safeguarding officers are super important, but that's just not it. Not sure if this was exactly the question, but the way I see it from the Olympic Games as someone that have been to the Olympic Games, if something have happened to me at the Olympic Village, I don't think that I would, oh, so where is the safeguarding officer that the IOC is providing, and then go to this person. I think it has to be collectively, because there are other barriers such as translation. I mean, so many barriers there.
Erin or Katie, did you have any that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I kind of echo Joanna's part. I think it's important for there always to be someone for people to go and talk to. Again, when we talk about the systemic issues and the cultural issues, it's not typically a one incident problem. And so recognizing that there needs to be more checks and balances within every country that's going to the Olympics, and putting that more on the federation and like the country that is responsible for those athletes and the safety of those athletes, and really making sure those checks and balances are in place much before the Olympics. Again, these things happen, they take time. It's not typically a one incident problem. And so just making sure that there are those things in place. But I think even at the international level, being able to have policies and procedures in place that don't allow for these things to happen, that are more strict, and, you know, potentially exploring options of what do we do when there is a known abuser competing at the Olympics or going to the Olympics and things like that, and asking those questions. Again, we want to get away from this reactive of something's happened, we need to report, to how do we make sure that these things don't happen to begin with.
Yeah, and I would echo too, just what Joanna and Erin said in terms of those safeguards of having it in place, and that there may be increased visibility to these issues around games time events, but these abuses are being perpetrated leading up to games, and thinking about the different protocols that exist within various countries and the policies. And so that's where the opportunities of different nations coming together and really talking about shared protocols, how we respond to these issues in these cases is really important. And I think more countries and different sport entities are coming together, sharing best practices in this regard. So there's the games time itself when we think about the Olympic and Paralympic Games itself, but also we think about within the Olympic and Paralympic movement, you have young kids and grassroots sports organizations that are part of that pipeline, leading up to being on the center stage at an event. And so thinking about the work that we can do from a preventions perspective early on, to make sure that those safeguards in place to prevent that harm from ever happening in the first place.
Thank you all. The next question is, so this person says, I'm curious how sports organizations and athletes have reacted or responded to your work. You are advocating for checks and balances of power, and as we know, people do not like to share or give that up. Have you received any negative feedback or backlash for the work that you're doing?
I can talk from a national perspective. I'm from Brazil. And I disclosed with my story, the sexual abuse that I was a victim of in 2008. And I think that just now in 2023, after I did a master's and then I have like a full-time job on the topics, that people are starting to respecting me. Because back then I was seen as a troublemaker. There was like questioning the status quo. And I think pretty much all of the victims go through it, because like I said on my part, we tend to see sport that is so beautiful and surrounded by all those amazing values that I think they are there. And I think Eric can agree with me, like going into the Olympic Village is amazing, and participating into the Olympics is like, it's great, but it's not just that. So yes, I've faced a lot of resistance in the last couple of years, but I also think that safeguarding that the field is advancing now when we think of the sports integrity umbrella. Because we have WADA, so anti-doping still have like the largest space when we talk about sports integrity, and now match fixing. So safeguarding has always faced a lot of resistance, but I think that in the last couple of years, we're advancing way more than 10 years ago.
I would echo that as well. I think there's a lot more acceptance right now, given all of the stories and all of the data that's come out. I can tell you in 2019, when we presented the results to the study of national team athletes, the first instinct was for everyone to try to discredit it and tell me that it's just disgruntled athletes that are filling out these surveys and like trying to pick apart the numbers. And so there was a lot more trying to excuse the behavior than trying to actually understand that this is a problem. In Canada, we've gone through a huge awakening in the past couple of years, which it's unfortunate that it took that point to really get the attention of the people in positions of power. But I think I've even noticed in the past year, there's been a huge shift in the tone, and people recognizing that it's not that we're out, and part of it is also the delivery. I think it's a lot harder when it's a combative of like, you need to fix this and you are wrong and all of that, but like understanding that a trauma-informed approach means that everyone has to work together to fix the solutions. And I think there's still a way to have accountability for the people that enacted the harm, but when we look at these are very systemic issues, and it's a lot of people who do a lot of small things, like maybe overlooks one thing, overlooked another, that are really feeling the heat and the defensiveness of that. And I think there needs to be accountability, but there also needs to be able to work together in a bit more of a safe space for everyone, so that people that need to be accountable and need to be in those positions of power feel that they can move forward without their backs against the wall too, if that kind of makes sense. So I would say that there was a lot of resistance. There's still a little bit, but I think overall, at least in Canada, the climate's changing a little bit.
I would agree too that we're beginning to see that climate change. I mean, sexual abuse is a societal issue. We certainly see it in sport, and we see more people having conversations across all sectors, which is a movement in the positive direction. And so I think as we all come together and collaborate on these issues, I think it just helps them move the needle to make it a better environment that's safer for survivors and really prioritizes prevention. And so anytime there's new guidance or policies or resources that come into the mix, that requires changes, but knowing that there are groups that can all support each other and help to do that. And I think lessons learned that we've seen in various countries of what works, what doesn't, and how we can develop a better solution together. We're starting to see that shift, which I'm really glad to see.
Thank you all. I actually have a question, if that's okay for me to ask. And I can't recall who was actually speaking on the slide that had the different vulnerable populations and things. And my question is, do you all foresee more changes coming that will specifically protect trans athletes, like specifically trans youth athletes? Because it seems that their human rights are already being impeded upon with the implementation of just like horrible policies, or trying to keep them out of sports, or trying to incorporate physical exams that are well, beyond your normal physicals that all athletes have. So I was just wondering if you all foresee more changes coming.
I can get the ball rolling here, and then Erin and Katie can continue. So what I think that the problem is that this situation is so polarized at the moment that we're not acknowledging. When Erin was talking about those associated risks in gender being the LGBTQ community, that's what we see in our prevalence study. That's what I found on my prevalence study as well. The people, and I mean, people who identify from the LGBTQ community, they carry this extra associated risk to suffer psychological, physical, and sexual violence. So that's one thing that we need to acknowledge. That's a group that carries an associated risk at the first point. Second, we need to base this discussion with science and human rights. It can just be science. It can just be human rights. When we talk about competitive sports, there are a lot of exclusion within competitive sports. So that's something that is pretty much as a characteristic of elite sports, which I think that goes against the inclusion. We need to give sports international federations because of the specificity that I was talking about, we need to give them autonomy on that sense to regulate. But we need to know how those discussions are being made, who is being invited to go to the table. And I say this because last year, FINA, now World Aquatics, they changed the name. They decided the rules last year at the World Championships. And it's the same rules as in World Athletic that pretty much bans trans athletes from participating. And when you go to see like who was invited, it was basically like people from science who are already against inclusion. So people from the trans community that are in favor, they were not invited to the discussion. I'm not saying that this would change anything, honestly. I think that sports very conservative and it would not change, but we need to invite these people in. And another point that I want to make is that banning trans women, because we're basically not talking about trans men. Banning trans women doesn't mean that we're gonna stop the violence that cis women that do not perform the femininity as we expect, it's going to end. So in the end, it's about controlling women's body. So that's something that we need to acknowledge as well.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So it looks like we're out of time. I don't know if Erin or Katie wanted to jump on that or not, but I am being pushed to end. So thank you all so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. We really appreciate it. But I do want to let everyone know that we're going to take a little break before the next session. So thank you all so much for coming and for your support, and thank you all again just for this wonderful presentation. We appreciate it.